Welcome, Tarnished. Today we're going to let the vengeful spirit of the Cold Flame Wraith rest and take a look at a real monster hunter, but not just any monster killer. We're going to be discussing a master vampire slayer, or one of them, Trevor Belmont. My stats for this build are 50 vigor, 15 mind, 26 endurance, 10 strength, 80 dexterity, 25 faith. I suggest starting as a bandit. I always wanted to try whips in Elden Ring. Being a little disheartened on how they were in Dark Souls 3, I slept on them. But after messing about with a friend of mine, I come to realize they're actually quite good. Best part is, you do not even need to make them bleed to be as effective. But before we get into the weapons, let's talk about the fashion. Seeing how Trevor in all but one of his iterations does not seem to wear any sort of headgear, I decided to slide on over to JTech 1 to get an idea of how I should make Trevor look. I decided on the recent Netflix appearance over his Curse of Darkness look. I'll leave a link to these videos below. I have this build split up in chapters, Incantations and Consumables, and our weapons and talisman details. With that out of the way, we can start analyzing the armor and equipment of our vampire slayer, Trevor Belmont. The armor I picked for this build is a mix of a few pieces: Raging Wolf armor, Godskin Apostle bracelets, and the Aristocrat's boots. After messing about with a few stat combinations, I tried to really reel in the feel of a mix between both anime and video game. To do that, we'll need to use 3 weapons, not including our seal. Hazo's Petal Whip to mimic the Vampire Killer, the Normal Whip, Noble Slender's Sword, or if you don't wish to farm this rare weapon, you can however use the Lord Sword Straight Sword. This is really our backup weapon to mix things up with Ashes of War, since the whip itself doesn't have very many options. Lastly, for our seal, I just stick with the normal finger seal since our faith isn't really high enough to make much of a difference with the buffs we'll use. But if you really want to fit more into the holy theme, the Erd-Tree seal looks like a cross. To complement our playstyle and the theme of our build, which we'll be using a few support incantations to mimic some of our holy abilities from the games and whip upgrades. Our incantation arsenal consists of Blessing's Boon, Vike's Dragon Bolt, Golden Vow, and Barrier of Gold. All these are utility for our kit, seeing how we will primarily be focused on using our whips for our main damage source, backed up with bombs, knives, and perfumes to mimic item usages throughout the Castlevania series. Let's start with the utility incantations before going to the other tools. Blessing's Boon, an incantation that provides a buff to the players and nearby allies that restores HP. It does sack with the Blessed Dew Talisman, which provides a similar effect, though instead of the 8 per second we get with the incantation, the Talisman only provides a +2. So if you ever find yourself needing to heal up a bit without wasting Crimson Flask, you can throw both of these on at once to give you that nice little health regeneration. Heals a total of 720 HP total, and the buff lasts for 90 seconds, requires 24 faith, and costs 30 FP and 30 stamina. I use this incantation before the boss to assist allies in the event they do get clipped by an attack. With the 8 per second, it can really help in certain situations. Where it shines though is whenever you need to clear an area that might give you a bit of trouble, like the graveyard of Rhea Lucaria with all the zombies and dogs. It also damages accursed enemies like the annoying grafted bosses. Vike's Dragon Bolt, our only weapon buff, an incantation that reinforces our right-handed weapon with red lightning. This does give us a bit of a damage boost. I picked this up to mimic the lightning whip from Curse of Darkness. This takes our AR of our Hazo's Petal Whip from 503 to 636, also increases our equip load by 15%, though that isn't really too important. The buff lasts 70 seconds, but beware, it reduces your lightning negation by 35%, so I wouldn't use this against bosses that also have that damage type. The scaling is 0.75 times incantation scaling, but only the faith portion. Requires 23 faith, costs 35 FP, and 20 stamina. I use this incantation regularly. The damage boost is nice, you only run into trouble using it against bosses that deal heavy lightning damage or have high lightning resistance, so skip out on using it against most of the ancient dragon bosses like Lanciax and her ilk. But if you want something different, while it isn't as long as the lightning buff, the black flame buff is good for burning enemies that would otherwise be resistant to lightning, giving us the fire whip, so to speak. Golden Vow, an incantation that boosts our attack and defense as well as allies. Boosts damage in PvE by 15% while being a 7.5 increase in PvP. The damage negation in PvE is 10%, and while PvP it is cut in half, you can however stack this with the boiled crab or prawn food if you want that extra increase in damage negation. The buff lasts 80 seconds in total, which is pretty long in most cases, and should get you a good chunk of a damage boost during a boss encounter if you can really lay down hits. Works great with our Rotted Wing Talisman to also boost damage from our hits, which I will go into later. Requires 25 faith, costs 47 FP, 50 stamina, and requires only 1 spell slot. Lastly, we have the Barrier of Gold. Barrier of Gold increases magic damage negation by 60%, lasts 70 seconds, These values don't change in PvP, so it is a good option for a defensive spell against casters. Requires 24 faith, 30 FP, 13 stamina, and like our other incantations, it only uses one spell slot. This is our optional utility buff. It does stack with Golden Vow as well as Blessing Boon. However, it does overwrite the body buff of Vike's Dragon Bolt, which allows you to remove the downside of the incantation while keeping the weapon buff. Our utility isn't paramount for the build's viability. Think of these as specials if you want to put it that way. Tools that you can rely on for unique situations, besides Vikes, which is more commonly used than the rest. We will be now splitting up our FP between incantation usages and Asters of War and our perfumes. Now I know what you're thinking. Perfumes? Yeah, perfumes. See, firebombs are good. And same with the volcano variants, but the thing is, the bombs scale with strength for the most part outside the holy ones. Perfume, on the other hand, scales with dexterity, or the type we'll be using anyhow. Bombs are going to be good against certain enemies, and being able to carry both, it'll allow us to swap between longer range explosives and shorter range explosives. The bombs we're going to use are fire bombs, volcano bombs, holy water pot. Perfumes we are going to use is the Spark Aromatic. And the throwables, we got throwing daggers, fan daggers, explosive stones, and lastly our consumables, Exalted Flesh, Pickled Turtleneck, Boiled Prawn, and our Physic Flask. The reason I listed food items outside the reason that they are similar to items in Castlevania is because it allows us to save on FP if we do not need bigger buffs that the incantations give us. Food is consumed quickly on the move, and can be eaten during combat for a quick boost. We're going to go down the list here real quick, as these are pretty simple and easy to farm or buy from merchants, and with bombs or perfume bottles regenerating after use, it makes it a lot easier to use a guide to pick up all the available pots and bottles in the game to mass even more of these useful items. Keep in mind, you can use the companion jar talisman to increase the potency of all these throwing pots by 20%, It's nice to swap out this with the Perfume or Talisman, depending what you're doing exactly. The Fire Bombs and the Volcano Bombs work hand in hand with each other for the most part, though while Fire Bombs deal more direct damage on hit, the Volcano Bombs are useful for if a boss decides to stand still, especially against bigger enemies that can be caught in the cloud while you attack them. A little trick, you can farm a bunch of these materials for the Volcano Bombs at Seethwater Terminus. Right next to it is 3 clumps, and if you run the river and back, you can get around 100 each time, making it the easiest bomb to farm out of all these. So make good use of that. In PvP, these are useful as well for free aiming and tossing at those who wish to stay at a distance or to roll catch someone getting away. The Volcano Bomb's cloud will keep people from pressing you, even though it doesn't really do too much damage, at least in duels anyways. Hate Deathbirds? Undead? Well, some Holy Water will cast aside those foul monsters. Even with our faith scaling, it does quite a bit of damage to those that are of death. Honestly, I didn't really think the Holy Water would be this useful, but I was proven wrong. The Companion Jar Talisman really helps us out a lot, and when it comes to fighting these kind of enemies, especially these bosses. Quickly going over the perfume you'll be using, Spark Aromatic. Broadly scatters sparks in a wide arc. It is flashy, covers a lot of ground in front of you, and explodes. The fact it also scales with dexterity allows us to really make good use of the scaling, plus our Perfumer's Talisman that raises the potency of all perfume arts that deal damage by 20%. Altogether, we can get solid damage numbers, and it's pretty solid of a choice to hit multiple enemies coming your direction too. It is quick as well, only consuming 9 FP per cast, can be used up close instead of bombs, and staggers some enemies, allowing you to follow up with the slash of your whip. Personally, I like to use this and then crouch attack with the whip to get a fast strike. Onto the throwables. The knives are pretty similar in how they are used to poke from a distance. The normal ones either scale A or S with dexterity. The cool thing about these throwing knives is that it allows you to keep enemies from fully recovering their posture, so you can use these between hit and run phases, even if the damage is only around 100 to 180, depending. You can carry a lot of these, 40 in fact, and they really come in handy, especially if the boss is low on HP. I really don't see these used much, and I have seen hosts die trying to get the last poke on a boss before it obliterates them for stepping into melee range. Not to mention they are a spellcaster's bane in PvP. Seriously. The fan daggers are a little bit different in how they work, but still follow a similar type of play. Think Bestial Sling, but less damage with no FP cost. They come out quick, and against bigger enemies you can land most of the knives being thrown. These are more close range than the throwing knives, but are still useful for hitting multiple targets, especially fodder enemies. Though I find myself using these in PvP more than PvE, since they are easy to use against players to interrupt them or pop their bubble. You can throw up to 40 of these, and each throw launches 5 of them. Lastly, onto the explosive stone. This can easily be obtained at the round table hold. These explosive stones inflict fire damage on contact. It can be used similar to fire bombs to give you a little bit more to throw without the worry of farming materials. These stones, however, are useful the same way the bombs are. Though they deal less damage, it is useful to carry them around if you run out of bombs before you get to the Grace or during a boss fight. These should be your last resort on throwables. However, it can be handy if you rather spend your jars on volcano pots instead of fire bombs. Now onto the food, or consumables. To keep this sweet and short as possible with these food buffs before going into the flask mixtures I use for both PvP and PvE, these will be used to offset the FP costs for shorter term buffs that can be used quicker than the incantations as mentioned already. Exalted Flesh. Temporarily boosts physical attack by 20% in PvE with a 5% less in PvP. Lasts 30 seconds. Even if this requires arterial leaves, you can find a handful of these throughout the game before you need to craft them. Can carry up to 10 at a time. Pickle Turtleneck. Temporarily boosts stamina recovery by plus 10 a second, roughly a 22% increase. Duration is 60 seconds and can carry up to 10 at a time. And Boil Prawn. Boosts physical damage negation by 15%, lasts 60 seconds, can carry up to 99 at a time. Now, moving on to our Physic Flasks. I chose 2 tiers here. I've grown comfortable using them in both PvE and PvP. Thorny Cracked tier. Increases damage by 9%, 13%, and 20%. Lasts at 3 whole minutes, stacks with our Talisman, Rotted Wings Sword Insignia, which also increases our damage in 3 tiers, 6%, 8%, and 13%. This is incredible for our damage output with both of our whips, really punching up into the very lethal damage numbers against bosses and enemies, and even players. Since we can play aggressive with the whips or sword, it rewards us for managing stamina as well as playing on the offense as much as possible, especially considering that the Petal Whip has innate bleed, to give us a little bit more damage for being aggressive and proccing that bleed. This is a bit harder in PvP as people generally try not to get hit, but in invasions, you can really lay down the law with this tier, especially against multiple targets who try to play aggressive towards you, allowing you to turn and burn if needed. Don't be afraid of jump attacks if this is activated as well for big damage. Our next tier is the Crimson Bubble tier. Basically Tears of Denial, restores 30% max HP when health is at 20% or lower, effect lasts for 3 minutes or when HP restoration triggers, will not prevent death and will otherwise send you to the underworld. With these two together, we can play a very attack focused build that allows us to make a few mistakes with a second life, so to speak, with the Crimson Bubble tier. But once it wears off, or procs, you should switch back to a hit and run playstyle in order to secure the kill, unless you're confident you can keep up the aggressive play without getting decimated by a boss or players. Now that we have the utility covered, we'll go over the weapons and their moveset, as well as the details of their scaling and the AR with this build. If you made it this far, I want to say thank you for the 500 subscribers. As of making this video, we are sitting at 560, a small and growing community. I'm beyond happy about this, and I love the fact that you all seem to enjoy sharing your thoughts on my builds, whether it be critique or just your love for the ideas. And to think, we were only at a little over 100 a few months ago. Let's get to 1,000, guys. I have a little something special I'm putting together for the occasion, so keep an eye out. But with that out of the way, let's get into it. You are a Belmont through and through, slaying the evil in the lands between, ridding the world of darkness and sin. Let's start analyzing our prize piece, the Vampire Killer. The Petal Whip. This chain whip is going to be our primary weapon for this build, of course in themed fashion for the famous Vampire Killer, or the Morningstar. Hazo's Petal Whip with our current build gives us an AR of 508, along with the bleed build up of 55. Since we're going dexterity with this build, I threw on the Keen enhancement. I know most people do bleed for proc and the extra damage, while it is viable in its own right since bleed is by far the strongest status in Elden Ring. I, however, want to keep this as close to the theme as possible, with B scaling and dexterity at plus 25, and the quickstep Ash of War to give us some nice dodging since whips don't really have access to a lot of Ashes of War that fit the theme. You can use Bloodhound Step if you wanted to, but after the nerf, I feel more comfortable with quickstep, and you don't have to kill a boss to get the Ash of War. Our next weapon as we're going to keep in our offhand is the normal whip. It also is keen just like our entire arsenal. At plus 25, the AR on the whip is 479, a little lower than the Petal Whip. The movesets on the whips besides the Irumi are very similar if not the same, so I'll be putting both of our whips side by side, especially considering the fact we'll be using power stance. But let's start with the one-handed attacks first. The Petal Whip lashes out in a 4-hit mid-range combo. This isn't really a bad option of attack. It doesn't really cost nearly as much damage as the L1 combo. The one-handed R2 is an average speed attack that lashes the whip in a horizontal motion, covering a lot of forward ground. While in charge it does decent damage, but when charged, it has a very misleading hitbox. And not only does it do decent poise damage since it's a charged heavy, it can roll catch people who are expecting you to keep pressing the attack. I use this for a mix-up often in PvP, but for PvE, when you have your talisman active, it can really be destructive. Now, onto the L1. This is the 3-hit heavy stamina required combo. However, it lashes out with both of our whips, proccing the Rotted Winged Talisman, which increases our damage by 6%, 8%, then 13%, as well as stacking our Thorny tier, which gives us the highest tier of attack, a 20% increase from the Flask, and a 13% increase from the Talisman. What you want to do is mix up attacks between the fatiguing L1s. While this will be your usual go-to, I wouldn't rely heavily on spamming it. Sure, it does the most damage, but if you don't manage your stamina properly, you'll be in some serious trouble. It took me a bit to get used to with the whip compared to my last build with 2 straight swords. The jumping attacks are one of our most used attacks for the whip. Good damage, good speed, and good recovery. To also mention, we're using the Claw Talisman, which increases your jump attack damage by 15%. Keep this percentage in mind as well whenever you have your Talisman and Thorny tier activated at the same time. You can get some pretty nutty damage, even if it isn't as consistent as one would hope. The L1 variant over the single-handed heavy and light has more range and costs more stamina, but does way more damage. The L1 jumping attack should be your first option out of these 3. The running attacks are fairly straightforward, with a forward stepping lash in one hand. On the L1, however, your attacks press forward with both whips, reaching quite far. So if you can learn to incorporate backsteps into your style of play, it can be useful for spacing or getting off the attack quicker. What I do love about the whips though, besides the power stance, is the crouch attack. It's fast, reliable, and has a decent range poke, which can be mixed up with a low stamina cost as well. You could throw this out in the mix if you hit and run attacks against bosses and even roll catch players. I am going to list some of the Ashes of War below that I recommend on the whip and what affinity. King Quickstep, King Raptors of the Mist for jump attacks, Sacred Order for Deathbirds, and as well as other beings of death if you're struggling, which I found very useful against Deathbirds alongside Holy Water. I wouldn't recommend this otherwise, and since the Golden Order Incantations for Holy requires investment in intellect, this is our only other option if you need that Holy damage. If you do take this, however, I would swap out the Crimson Bubble tier for the Holy Cracked Crystal tier to give us an extra 20% Holy damage in PvE, which lasts 3 minutes. Moving on to our backup weapon, the Straight Sword. Think of this as a tool more so than our weapon. Sometimes enemies are a bit too quick and aggressive for our whip, and we need to fall back on the classic sidearm. I chose the Noble Slender Sword since it has a higher scaling and dex than other straight swords, other than the Warhawk's Talon, but to keep the fashion we'll either be picking this rare sword or the Lord Sword Straight Sword. At plus 25, each of these swords with Keen have a very similar AR, Noble Sword with 527 and Lord Sword 525. The Straight Sword moveset is reliable and basic, quicker than our whips in some cases. I have a few Ashes of War I would recommend for these swords to keep the theme. Keen Double Slash and Keen Spinning Slash. Double Slash and Spinning Slash may not be the flashiest Ashes of War, but they are effective at cleaning up enemies who are swarming you. Personally, I like both of these quite a bit, given their simplistic nature. Double Slash I had a better result in PvE, and Spinning Slash I had a better result in PvP. Since this build isn't as heavily reliant on Ashes of War for damage, we won't be picking up Shard of Alexander. Instead, for our other 2 talisman slots left, I decided to do more supportive things for our survivability. Crimson Medallion plus 2. I never swap this out. Giving an extra 8% HP feels amazing whenever we're only sporting 50 vigor. Of course, if you're more confident in your skill, then you can always replace this with the Green Turtle Talisman, which raises stamina recovery by 8 per second, roughly a 17% increase. I swap out this next slot quite a bit for these 3 talismans. Carrion Filigree Crest, which lowers their FP cost of skills by 25%, Perfumer Talisman, raises the potency of the perfume arts by 20%, and Companion Jar Talisman, raise the potency of throwing pots by 20%. I personally find myself sticking with the Crest and Amber Medallion before boss encounters to save on resources with my bombs and perfumes. Though in PvP, bombs are not as efficient as they were in Dark Souls 3, and I haven't really had too much luck with perfumes either, but they can be useful for tripping up people. However, if you're going to go into PvP, I suggest sticking with the Crest and Medallion. If I had a suggestion for this build for PvP, it would be to play more defensively. Wait for openings, use the knives often, especially against casters and those who want to stay at medium range of your attack. The whips aren't going to one-shot somebody, but I have plenty of people heal and leave in duels because it can be a frustrating setup that will prolong fights to your favor. With Quickstep and the amount of utility you carry with you, you could put people on their toes or force them to play into your attacks, especially with the odd hitboxes on a whip that aren't as simple as a sword. Hey guys, thanks for watching my 4th build video in the series. I usually show an up next, but I haven't really had a time to create a second build after this one like I did before. But I will have one soon. Besides that, I am going to start a modded playthrough in Dark Souls 1 and upload throughout the week. I really appreciate you all for giving me feedback, as well as providing a lot of positive comments. I am genuinely blown away by how much traction these videos have gotten, and I do not plan to stop. If Elden Ring gets a DLC, I will be on top of that as fast as I can. Again, thank you so much for sticking around this long. I love doing this so much, and honestly, it's what keeps me going. All of you stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next video. Tarnished.